This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Samantha Bennett with the K-State Radio Network. We begin today's programming with K-State Weed Science Specialist Sarah Lancaster. She provides insight on updates to the latest edition of the Chemical Weed Control Guide, as well as sheds a light on the latest changes from the EPA when it comes to enforcing the Endangered Species Act. We are also joined by Dr. Vincent Amanor-Boadu, who serves as an agriculture economics professor here at K-State. In our conversation with him, he shares insight on the current economy and steps that business owners and leaders in the agricultural industry can take to combat challenges that they are now facing. As dairy producers select seed for corn silage for 2023, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk ends today's program by encouraging producers to not only look at trial results, but to also talk with their neighbors about the performance of the corn hybrids that they've actually used over the last few years. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are joined now by Sarah Lancaster. She is our K-State Weed Science Specialist, and she's joining us today to talk about several topics, the first of which being the newly released 2023 Chemical Weed Control Guide. So, Sarah, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Samantha.
Absolutely. So this 2023 Chemical Weed Control Guide, it's an annual publication, and we just wanted to discuss a few of the things that changed in the past year or so.
Yeah, so this baby is a labor of love every year, Samantha, for myself and a lot of folks. So we're always excited when we can tell folks that it's ready to go. So folks right now can access the electronic copy. We will not have hard copies for stocking stuffers, unfortunately, but we will have them available after the first of the year.
So we'll link to that. So listeners, if you're tuning in online and you want to pull it up as we're talking through some things, go ahead and do that. We'll link to it in the show notes, which can be found on agtoday.net. But Sarah, let's start with some of the corn products that you have newly listed.
Yeah, so there's really 4 corn products that we were able to evaluate in field trials this year and have been added to the weed control guide because they do have full labels from the EPA. So the first one to talk about would be Calibra. It's a Syngenta compound, and it is a premix of metolachlor and atrazine. So this particular premix could be advantageous for some folks if they want more flexibility in the atrazine rate that they're using on their corn. Atrazine has been under a lot of scrutiny from environmental groups for a long time, and that continues to kind of ratchet up. So a premix that lets you add the atrazine independently could be beneficial for some folks. Another product is Maverick from Valent. This is one that I've heard a little bit of buzz about from some farmers and such. So Maverick is basically Zidua plus Callisto plus clopyralid. So it's a good product. We did look at it in field trials against the competitors, and it worked well for us here in Manhattan this year. The third corn product that we've added is a product called Trivolt. So we've looked at this one for a couple of years now. It's a premix of flufenicet, which is in the same herbicide group as things like Dual and Harness and Outlook. It's not used in a lot of products here in the U.S., but it is used widely in the European market. So it provides good grass control. I would say probably not as strong on the pigweeds as some of those other herbicides in the related group. But Trivolt has flufenicet, isoxafludel, which is Balance. So folks are probably familiar with Balance, and this particular Trivolt herbicide carries all of the same label restrictions that Balance does in terms of application timings and groundwater concerns. And then the third product in Trivolt is something called thioncarbazone. It's an ALS inhibitor that folks might know It's an ALS inhibitor that folks might know. It's a component of Varo or Corvus, if folks are familiar with that. The last product to talk about for new corn chemicals is Resicor XL. So folks that grow corn are probably familiar with Resicor. It's a Corteva product that's a premix of acetochlor, so Harness, plus clopyralid and Callisto. So the Resicor XL just has a little different ratio combination and looked good in our trials this last couple of years.
Wonderful. So with these new products listed in the publication, what can producers that look to the guide, what can they kind of expect to see from these in terms of information listed?
Yeah, so in the guide, we will have basically an entry for every product that we have evaluated and have been asked to include in the guide or think we should include in the guide that has basically a summary of some of the most important components of the herbicide label. So herbicide labels are hard to read, right? And so we try to summarize some of the most important points. And, we do that in cooperation with our observations, our reading of the label, the company's reading of the label. So It's a good summary and definitely not a substitute for the label, but if folks are looking at, just what are their options, they can definitely look at those entries.
Especially this time of year, as producers are maybe experiencing some downtime and they're trying to prepare for next year, what they want to do, this might be something to consult and look at.
Absolutely. So one of the other things that's in the guide, Samantha, is a list of herbicide prices. Full disclaimer, we know that it's not probably what any farmer is actually going to pay, but we try to put things on an apples-to-apples comparison as best we can. So if folks are, sitting on a cold day and they've got the chores done and they want bookwork to do, they can start looking through some of those comparisons and figure out maybe what they want to talk to their retailers about in terms of effectiveness and pricing.
Great resource for sure, and that doesn't end at corn. It goes on to soybean products as well. So there's 2 new products that you have listed this year. Let's talk through those.
Yeah, so the 2 new products that we put in the guide this year are, number 1, Preview, which is a UPL product. It's a premix of metribuzin and sulfentrazone. So, with the limited number of new active ingredients that affects both corn and soybeans, in soybeans, we're starting to see a lot more use of those 2 products. In particular, there's been a lot of talk about, are we really using metribuzin as best we can in our soybean weed management systems. And so this is a product from UPL that does have metribuzin and sulfentrazone. So, farmers hear me say those 2 products and they may immediately kind of tense up and say, oh, crop injury. So, we did evaluate crop injury in our field trials this summer when we were looking at Preview, and it was there, but it was temporary and it didn't affect yields. So the other product is Tindovo. It's a Syngenta product that's a premix of dual metribuzin again, and an ALS inhibitor, chloranthalam. So that gives us a little bit of activity in some of our large-seeded broadleaves, in addition to that focus on the pigweed control that we have to have here in Kansas.
Sarah, today while we have you in studio, I also wanted to take a moment to discuss some of the EPA changes that have recently come out having to do with the Endangered Species Act. I know that might be a concern for a lot of producers, so let's talk through what they should know.
Sure. So a lot of the listeners in Kansas first became familiar with the Endangered Species Act and its potential impact on herbicides with some hiccups that were related to the release of Enlist 1 and Enlist Duo in that re-registration process during 2022. So there were some counties that were labeled off because of the presence of an endangered species. Fortunately, in that case, Corteva did have the data that was needed to get those counties labeled. It just things got out of sync timeline-wise. So that ended well.
Sure.
But the EPA, basically as a result of a lot of lawsuits, is obligated to start enforcing the Endangered Species Act when they approve new herbicides or anytime there's a label change to herbicides. So some of the things that are important here is that the enforcement of the Endangered Species Act means that the EPA has to do basically due diligence to prevent any, quote, takes of endangered species. Threatened and endangered species are including plants, animals, amphibians, fish, everything. But what a take is anything that would harm, injure, kill, threaten one of those protected species. So it's a much stricter view on the regulations than maybe we're accustomed to. So there's a couple of key herbicides that are on the short list for re-registration reviews, and that's one of the actions that triggers these additional requirements for the labels. So one of the key ones is atrazine. We mentioned when we were talking about the corn products that atrazine is always under a lot of environmental scrutiny, but it's such an important product. So some of the new changes for the atrazine label that's currently being revised is going to include some rate restrictions for the state of Kansas, so reducing the rates a little bit more, and then a pick list of mitigations. So we saw this pick list on the Enlist 1 and Enlist Duo labels. And basically those practices on the pick list are all designed to keep the herbicide in the field and keep it from running off and getting into water, into aquatic environments. So it's a lot of soil conservation practices that probably a lot of the listeners, a lot of the farmers are already doing. So it's just going to be another thing to double check for on the label and make sure you're using the right number of practices for each particular field. The other thing that actually came up in a session at the conference I attended last week, we had our regional weed science meetings last week, and short shout out to my students. They both won in their oral presentation sections. Not that I'm a proud advisor or anything, but one of the things that came up and nobody had a good answer for, including the folks that were there representing regulatory bodies, is how are you going to enforce whether the pick list requirements have been met? Who's responsible for that record keeping and what does that actually look like? So, we're still kind of building the plane as we're flying it to some degree here, as far as knowing all of the details. But folks are definitely going to start hearing more about these pick lists and some other mitigations that are going to be put on herbicide labels. So not necessarily fun news, Samantha, but I think it's an important message to share with listeners as we think about, how, in my case, how am I as a weed scientist going to work within these regulations and try to exercise my voice on behalf of Kansas farmers to make sure that the regulations that are in place are as workable as we can get them.
Absolutely. Well, we can't thank you enough for that update. I'm sure it is super helpful in answering a lot of listeners' potential questions that they may have. And Sarah, if they're maybe a little bit more concerned and have more questions, who's a good contact or a good resource for them from this point forward?
So things are still being kind of worked out on a lot of this. As always, I'm happy to entertain any questions. The best way for folks to get a hold of me is to get a hold of their county or district ag agent. And, there will be also Syngenta reps in the field that are, by and large, very well versed on the atrazine issues. But I think each product that is coming through this re-registration is going to have a little bit of nuance to how it works out. So it's just another level of record keeping and details for folks to keep straight in order to demonstrate that we are good stewards of the technology that we have.
Absolutely, and something to stay in the know on for sure in the months or so ahead when more of this becomes more settled. So, Sarah, thank you again so much. I appreciate you coming in today.
Thanks for having me, Samantha.
Absolutely. Once again, that was K-State Weed Science Specialist Sarah Lancaster joining us for a conversation on the 2023 Chemical Weed Control Guide updates, as well as some EPA changes when it comes to endangered species. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. We are back now and joined by Dr. Vincent Amanor-Boadu, and he is joining us for a conversation starting with a look at the macroeconomics that we are currently facing in the United States and abroad, but also we're going to talk about some of the microeconomic things and topics as well that can help producers in handling these situations. So, Dr. Vincent, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So, there's a lot going on in the world right now. We were chatting beforehand, and a lot of the times we like to complain and be negative when we think about these things, but there's some things we can do as well personally, individually, to help combat those issues. So starting with the macro look, we have the Great Resignation going on, and you've written about that recently. So let's start with that.
Well, the Great Resignation is coined as one of the things that fell out of the COVID environment. Once COVID hit, one of the first things governments around the world did was shut down the economy because, sincerely, nobody knew what it was all about. Nobody knew what the problem was, how long it was going to take for us to fix it, and what was driving all the infections. So they shut down the economy across the world for precautionary reasons, and we had never done that prior in any situation. 100 years ago, when we had the first Spanish influenza, which was similar to this COVID, the world wasn't as connected as it was. The world was at war. As a matter of fact, the Western world, with the exception of Spain, didn't even acknowledge there was a pandemic going on. It was the media in the United States were banned, punishable by treason if they talked about it. And that's how it became the Spanish flu, because only Spain was talking about it.
Wow, I had no idea.
Right? And do you know where it started from? Here in Kansas. Spanish flu started here in Kansas. But we banned it. Fast forward 102 years, and we have COVID. And so people start looking at it and say, this is similar, and it's global, and we don't know how fast and how long it's going to be. So they shut the whole place down. And for the first time, people had the opportunity to think about what they were doing. The traditional life we've had has been, you go to school, you go to college, you graduate, you get a job, and then you start working, and you do what you are doing for 40 years. You retire, and they're forever happy after. And now people stopped and had a time to reflect on what their life was all about and started valuing things that they've been doing without questioning. And that led to a lot of structural changes and behavioral changes in what people were doing. There were people that were saying, well, people are not going back to work because we gave them too much money. The money went to people who were not earning more than $75,000. And the majority of the people who were having impact on the economy were people who were earning above that. So it wasn't unemployment insurance or the monies that were given to people to keep them, going during that period. Yes, the government printed a lot of money during that period, and it was not arbitrary. For example, the administration at the time, the first quarter of 2000, printed about $5 trillion. Why? Because the U.S. economy is about $20 trillion. And if you shut down the economy and there was no production, they wanted to maintain the momentum. So they pumped that money into the economy. The bulk of that money, sincerely, went into investments because people who got the bulk of that payment, paycheck protection, all that stuff, they were going to protect the employees anyway. So those monies went into investments. They didn't accelerate the economy or do anything. We just maintained. But the result of people having time to reflect is that they started sort of paring down the activities. If you're making $100,000, you figured out that, well, $50,000 of that is stress. So I can get rid of that 50 and live on the remaining 50. And we're comfortable with that. So people said, I don't want that job anymore. In some companies, they figured it out and changed the environment, talked to the employees and figured out what type of work environment do you want to come back to. So they engaged the employees to start thinking about coming back. Other people didn't. And that's what we see with, the massive non-return of employees after the lockdown, which is what we coined the Great Resignation for.
Sure, absolutely. And we have inflation today that we recognize, and I think a lot of people think short term, they're like, oh, this year has just caused inflation. But really, kind of that Great Resignation has played a key role in the inflation we're seeing now as well, right? The
inflation we are seeing in the United States today and around the world, by the way, not just in the United States, is a very different type of inflation. And it goes back to the pandemic. Prior to March 2000, the world was cruising along at, the normal 2%. So what happened? What basically happened was the world's factory shut down. And by the world factory, I'm talking about China. Everything comes from China. And when China shut down, there were no goods. And what you find is that we shut down the economy in March. When we shut down the economy, there were still boats on the sea coming with goods. There were inventory. So we had this delay in shutting down the economy on supply. But as people were not, importers and retailers were not ordering things from factories, and they had also shut down, their workers were not there, they started reducing what was available. And then input suppliers started reducing what was available. So you had this bullwhip effect where one thing happened, and then there was a wider ripple that was happening as we went further away from the source. And then we opened the economy. But by the time we opened the economy and people started consuming what was already in inventory, new goods were not coming in. And then we saw demand because, I still buy my computer. I need a new computer. Well, there were no chips because the chip factory had closed. Mm-hmm. So what are you going to do? You really want that computer. So you bid up the price. And that's the type of inflation we are seeing.
Focusing on producers here, many producers are feeling the effects of that inflation in a lot of different ways, whether it's input costs for fertilizers or seeds they're buying, things of that nature. So I guess our next conversation that we'll carry on here is kind of what producers can do in their own environment and how they can navigate these difficult waters that we're currently in to best fit their needs.
Right. When you get these macro events happening, the first thing that I tell leaders of organizations, producers that I work with is it's affecting everybody. So what we saw, for example, in 2021 was that a lot of producers normally buy their fertilizer ahead of time, so they were okay. Fertilizer issue is one that is related. Well, China, once again, supplies a bulk of that. But Russia and Belarus are major suppliers of fertilizer, as well as Ukraine. And the disturbance there is also causing some of the tight supply situations that we have. Good news is it's also causing a tight supply of grain. So we see costs going up, and we see grain prices going up. What can we do? Well, we cannot do much in the short term about fertilizer. We just don't have the capacity at home to meet those. And then there are also headwinds on how you produce this. Well, nitrogen, ammonia, which is one of, is the largest used fertilizer we have globally, not just here. We traditionally produce this from natural gas. When supply of natural gas tightens as a result of this war, what is happening is that prices of natural gas is going up, which means fertilizer prices are going up. And we saw for the first time ammonia prices crossing $1,500 per metric ton. So what can we do? We have to start thinking long term. Some of the work we are doing with our Food, Energy, and Water Nexus project, which is funded by the National Science Foundation, is looking at how we can capture the wind, which we have a lot of in Kansas, into electricity to produce ammonia on site. And that sort of eliminates one of the variables that causes some of the discomfort on farms. So I have electrical engineers here at K-State. We have a chemical engineer at Washington State. We have hydrologists and others in KU, about 4 universities involved in this research, where we are looking at the feasibility of on-farm production of anhydrous ammonia using electricity and the new technologies for converting these. So that's one way that we can deal with some of the variables that affect farmers.
Absolutely. And like you said, that's long-term here. Yeah. So a lot of this discomfort that we're feeling short-term is probably going to continue for, the foreseeable future. But there's other areas, too. I feel like keeping employees has become far more difficult, and there's a lot of factors that go into that.
Yeah. I mean, when you don't have employees, and, in grain production it's different because right now we don't use a lot of people in grain production. So Kansas is not really feeling that pain. But when you get into livestock, processing, like we have in the Southwest, if we don't have enough people working, that can cause a lot of problems. And we saw that at the beginning of the COVID when livestock employees in the processing sector were getting sick and we had to reduce production and increase space and slow down line speeds. It backed up and reduced the price of livestock that processors were buying. So, the economy is really tight that any pressure in one point will leak to the other segments. So what can we do there? Well, build better relationships. Build relationships with your employees so that they know you care. Because right now we are just poaching employees. The guy who is next door, your competition, who needs a forklift driver, is going to call your forklift driver and say, hey, I'll give you a signing bonus and give you $3 or $5 more an hour. Do you want to move over? If you are close to your employees and they know you care, the first thing that they do when that call comes in and it's very lucrative is that they come to you. And, as one CEO told me, I don't want my employees to tell anybody who calls them, I'll think about it. I want them to say, I'm not interested, right? So we have a farmer here in Kansas, Rich Porter, who is a very big benefactor of this institution. Rich has developed a very close relationship with his employees, and not only with his employees, with his buyers for his livestock coming in and livestock going out. And he's built these alliances in such a way that he is sharing some of these risks and uncertainties with people who ensure his business is successful. And why is Rich a good case study? Because he didn't start doing it during the inflation, and during all these challenges. It's his business style, right? And we tend to look at things in terms of price only. In the world in which we're going and which we are finding ourselves more and more, price is going to be less and less a factor in deciding your competitive advantage. And so we have everybody in our industry should start thinking about where those non-price advantages are and start making investments in them.
Absolutely. Trust being a huge part of that. I feel like you mentioned, that trust element there being key in understanding how to better build those relationships. And that doesn't happen overnight, like you said. It takes time. It
takes time. And also it takes respect. I mean, if you think your employees are talking to you about moving because they want to increase, how much you pay them, and that's the only thing you are thinking about. You are not going to think about the strategic implications. When they get that feeling from you, they don't talk to you. So when somebody calls, they're gone. And then you now have to replace them, but you are going to replace them at a higher price than you were incurring before. Most of the time, keeping an employee is a lot cheaper than hiring a new employee. But that is going to come from people trusting you enough to tell you what is going on in their own lives. And it's not just labor on the farm, the hand or unskilled labor. The most expensive component is your skilled labor, your accountant, your financial manager, your HR person, or worse, the person who is selling your produce downstream to a processor. Those are all very important people that make sure that your profitability is maintained. And if you don't pay attention to those, you are putting yourself in a very uncomfortable position.
Absolutely. Yeah, you mentioned the cost of hiring someone new, but there's also time costs as well, not just monetary. When you think of building that relationship back up and the understanding that comes with important relationships like your sellers and things like that. So
that's why it's always good. I mean, if you have a bad employee, I always say write them a good reference so they can leave. But if you can keep the employee, it's always cheaper. They know your system. They understand you. They know what you're all about. Anytime you bring in a new person, they have a learning curve. And that whole period, their productivity is below what you are paying them. And that is cost, right? And the person who is there for a fraction, you could have maintained that productivity and take advantage of it.
Well, Dr. Vincent, as we go into 2023, it's quickly approaching, crazy enough, what would your biggest words of advice for producers be going into this new year?
Well, I mean, producers are the most resilient people that you can ever meet. Agriculture is the most stable business. With all our variabilities and vagaries of prices and inputs and all that, the bottom line is people will eat, always. About 2 weeks ago, we crossed the 8 billion mark, the number of people on this planet. We got to feed all of those people. And so the work that farmers do is fundamental to the existence and peace of where we live on this planet. Yesterday, I spent some time with military officers from Fort Leavenworth, 125 from, I think, 70 countries. And we're talking about food security. Food security is national security. Who is providing that security? Farmers. So production is going to be demanded regardless. The thing is, we have to figure out how we do it so that these farmers are profitable enough to stay in business. And so what we do at Kansas State University, working with them and providing them with the right information so that they can make better decisions as they get into their business, helps them maintain that. As far as the global, macro environment goes, the feds are beginning to see that they have to pull back on their interest rate solution, because the risk is that because of that bullwhip effect, if they overreact, you are going to have a situation where we now have interest rates at levels that are not supporting the economy, and then that tips us into a recession environment. The other thing is, what we've seen in the last year or so is people who overreacted. The automobile industry, for example, is a large segment of our economy. And they overreacted, bought a lot of used vehicles at very high prices. And now the new vehicles are coming in. Are they going to take a loss on those so that we can start seeing things falling back? All those are going to play into how long it takes for us to get back to normal as people figure out whether or not they can take losses because of wrong decisions and bring the economy back. So the feds are going to do their part. I always say that. People like bashing them, but they're all very smart people, right? And everybody else in the system is going to do their part because the market is going to force us to figure that out. If, the guy on the next lot is selling his used cars at 20% or 30% off so that he can sell a new car quickly, our competitors are going to see that and they're going to respond. If everybody did that quickly, we'll get back to normal very fast. But like I said at the beginning of our conversation, Samantha, China is still the problem in this, right? In the way that if they can get back quickly, if their electricity plants can come up quickly, if their production and manufacturing can come up quickly, so that we can ease the challenge of the supply chain from their end, we will get back in business, because it will be cheaper, I think, for us to get China back than for us to start building factories here. And that's my position, because it takes a while to even, are we even going to find the workers for that? The solution is, well, let's have robots. Well, it'll be a while for us to automate all these systems that we have, and that costs money. So then prices are going to go up, and then we persist in the inflation world.
So resiliency is key, of course, going into this new year is the message I hear for that. And like you said, our producers are a prime example of being resilient. So encouragement there for producers to just keep trucking along. So Dr. Vincent, thank you so much for these words of wisdom today. I really do appreciate your time coming in.
Very welcome, Samantha. This is my favorite program.
Oh, that's kind. We appreciate that. Once again, that was Dr. Vincent Amanor-Boadu. He is a Ag Econ professor here at K-State. We'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. As dairy producers select seed for corn silage for 2023, they should do more than look at how well hybrids performed in trials. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says that talking with neighbors about the hybrids they've used and the results they've seen over the last few years also provides valuable information.
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning the selection of seed for your corn silage crop in 2023. I know many of you are very busy trying to make your seed selections for 2023. Some of you may have already made decisions on which hybrids you will raise, and there are some things that I wanted you to think about as you make these decisions. Tonnage is one of those. Total tonnage is important, but maybe for your dairy herd, the more important thing is total digestible tonnage. So when we think of digestible components of the corn silage, obviously starch is a very important part of that. So the greater the amount of starch in the material, the more likely we'll have a higher total digestible yield, but tonnage is still part of that. And when we think about digestibility, we also have to think about the digestibility of the fiber, and particularly the NDF that we find in that corn silage coming from the stalk and from the leaves and from the cob and a little bit from the grain, but most of it in the plant portion of the corn that we harvest for silage. So as you try to evaluate all of these things, there's an important concept that you need to keep in mind. Corn silage is maybe like your herd of cows. There are some animals in your herd that are more resistant to stress than others, and some that seem to strive under stressful conditions. So when we come to corn silage, there's a lot of hybrids out there that'll do really well in perfect conditions, but many of you have seen less than favorable growing conditions this past year, and we're not sure what 2023 might hold. So when you start to talk with your neighbors and you start to talk about yield and maybe quality that they're seeing in their corn silage based on the hybrids that they are raising under the exact conditions that you're trying to raise corn silage under, keeping in mind that there is a great difference between irrigated hybrids and hybrids that we might use on dry land acres, you need to take those things into consideration. Some hybrids will do better under severe stress. So if you're interested in trying to remove some of the possibility of a disaster, you want to choose those hybrids that are known in your area to do better under stressful conditions, i.e. heat, i.e. lack of rainfall. Those are the two things that generally trip up our corn silage yields the greatest. So take some time, drive around the neighborhood, visit with some of your neighbors, find out kind of which hybrids are doing better the last 3 years in your area, particularly in the years where we've had considerable stress. You might want to take that into consideration as you sit down and talk with the seed sellers, understanding that they're going to have brochures that are going to show you wonderful yields from trials that may even be from universities, but if those trials were done in Wisconsin and you're trying to raise corn in Kansas, maybe isn't the most helpful information because you have different growing conditions. as I look at data coming in from different parts of the United States, sometimes even with the same hybrids growing in vastly different locations, you can see large differences in yields. And you go to a state like Wisconsin and you start looking at some of their individual trial data. The university puts different hybrids through. Even in smaller areas within a single state, there can be significant differences in the growing conditions from the southern part to the northern part of the state. Therefore, hybrids are going to perform differently. And even though it's the same hybrid, just may not do as well in different areas of the state. So, as you make your seed selections for 2023, as you're considering corn silage hybrids, make sure that you take into consideration not only the literature that might come your way, either through a seed dealer or maybe through things that you found on the internet of university trials and other trials, but what's going on in your local neighborhood, which hybrids are actually doing better with the local conditions that you farm under in raising your corn silage. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike. For more information on seed selection, contact your county or district extension office. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Samantha Bennett, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.